Welcome to Women Lead, a production of the Women of Color Empowerment Institute. I'm Bernadette Norris Weeks.
I'm Michelle Austin Pammies.
And I'm Kathy Eggleston.
Today we'll be talking with Barbara Cheives about diversity and inclusion and why it is so important to continue to have those conversations even today.
Women Lead television show is being brought to you by Toyota.
This is James.
Jimmy!
Mom, Dad, this is James.
Jimmy!
James? James Harrison from Roosevelt High?
Jimmy! Jimmy! Oh! You good, Jimmy?
The 2021 Toyota RAV4.
Jimmy!
The RAV for all of you. Right now, lease a new 2021 Toyota RAV4 Elite for just $249 a month for 36 months. Toyota. Let's go places.
Barbara is the founder of Converge & Associates, a cultural competency and racial equity consulting firm whose clients include not-for-profits and government agencies across the United States. And among your clients include NASCAR, back on the sports arena. Thanks so much for joining us, Barbara.
Thank you. Barbara, we're really excited to have you. We've been having a conversation about diversity in the NBA. What we didn't talk about is ownership. Who owns the sports teams in the NBA and elsewhere? Is there diversity?
Actually, I looked at some numbers recently, and 70% of the players in the NFL are African American. I believe about 81% of the NBA is African American. The NFL has zero African American ownership. They have two minorities, if you will. One is the Jacksonville Jaguars, which is a Pakistani woman, and one is the Buffalo Bills. It has a Korean American man. In the NBA, the only team that's African American owned is the Charlotte Hornets, which is owned by the famous Michael Jordan. And interestingly enough, the first owner in the NBA was Robert Johnson, and he owned the same team, the Charlotte Hornets. So there's your ownership.
A lot of work to do, right?
It's one of those.
Oh, yes.
It's like that one minority slot. Is that what it is?
And there are a lot of minorities or African Americans with the money to own them. It's that they don't have the access.
That's interesting.
Okay.
Well, we've been talking a lot about how things may have changed post George Floyd and if things have changed. And so I'm really interested as someone who you train, you do a lot of diversity training for governmental entities, for businesses, private, companies. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in your business and whether you've seen any changes.
Interesting that you used George Floyd, because that was the summer of 2020. And I call it the summer of George Floyd. And my business was booming because everyone was calling. Everybody felt the need to have their staff talk. Think back, we were mid-COVID. No one was in the office. And I had an article that I sent to most of my clients that said, if you think your Black coworkers are okay, they're not. Because it was a tough summer, because it wasn't just George Floyd. So everybody was pulling together. They were doing training. We were doing Zoom training. We were doing Zoom meetings, giving people just an opportunity to talk about what was going on. But that has shifted.
In what way? I kind of feel in my day-to-day activities that moment seems to have passed. What are you finding?
It has passed. And here in the state of Florida, it's really passed with the passing of House Bill 7, which many people know as the Stop Woke Act. And the Stop Woke Act basically says that the training that I've been doing for 16 years can no longer be mandatory. So people think that's just for schools, but it's not. It's private industry, it's government entities. And at this point in time in Florida, none of that training can be mandatory. It has to be completely volunteer. In fact, one of our organizations gave me a disclaimer slide to add to my presentation.
What does it say?
It says that this training is voluntary. It is not mandatory.
Oh, Tell us about the training in particular. What type of training were you conducting that has become somewhat taboo?
The one is a training that, and I won't use the name of it, but because it comes from a national organization.
Okay.
But it's training that talks about the roots of racism in this country, why we are where we are today. how businesses, how banks were formed, how we got to today.
So basically, adults are also being monitored so that they don't engage in
Absolutely.
conversations.
They can attend the training, but it has to be voluntary.
And I understand you had a really interesting issue not long ago. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
I was training with the city. As I said, I train government entities. So within cities, for the last 20 years, I have trained police and fire. So I was with a city and I was doing training on microaggressions, things that people say that are hot buttons to certain races and ethnicities or genders. And a female police officer stood up mid-training and said, "This is bull.
Wow.
You're just training anti-whiteness."
Wow.
I am rarely speechless, but it took me a minute to respond. And the frightening piece of that is the HR director for that city was in the room.
Oh my.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my. Well, I'm almost speechless at that, but from my perspective, as someone who has gone through diversity and inclusion training, as a professional, I want to understand to the best of my ability how to treat people, how people may be different than myself or those I know. Why wouldn't everyone want that? I feel it's been a benefit to me.
I read that bill through several incarnations, and it's evolved so much. But one of the linchpins to the bill is that we can't say anything that makes one group feel like they have mistreated another group. And we can't say anything to make the majority uncomfortable.
I wonder what group that is that would be uncomfortable if they learned about slavery.
Or if they learned about the Holocaust,
right?
For
Yes.
that matter.
Right.
Who would be uncomfortable? But especially adults. They were saying at first that it was geared towards children,
Yes.
but apparently
It's not.
it's not.
It's not. I have one city in particular that's afraid to have the training because their commission is afraid that some of the staff members will be uncomfortable.
So let's say you're working for a city, you're training, and the city has had a lot of problems with EEOC charges, etc. Doesn't the city feel the need to have diversity training to avoid liability?
We're rebranding it with some of those cities.
Yes.
Because the state does require that cities teach harassment training. So we have rebranded some of this training into harassment training. But there's still some things that are not supposed to be said. Like I should not say implicit bias because the understanding is that that's a myth.
So when you teach this harassment training, is it supposed to be harassment for like sexual harassment, or are we talking harassment? Like, for instance, I've been involved in an investigation that I conducted for a municipality where it was a really egregious thing that happened involving a noose and some other things that were, that were revealed during this investigation. And so how would your harassment training address something like that?
I could talk about who we can and cannot harass. I could talk about what harassment looks like. I can talk about the noose being inappropriate.
Oh my.
I would not be able to give you the history of the noose.
Right.
Because then I would be talking about lynching and pre-civil rights and things that would make people uncomfortable.
And of course, that's where it all stems from.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the upsetting part about this is I honestly believe that some people would treat people differently if they understood the history.
One thing I've always wondered about in corporate America generally, I've heard that having a diverse workforce is good for the bottom line. It's really supposed to improve.
Are showing that.
Yeah,
Yes.
improve the bottom line. So why is it then that since it's supposed to be profitable, it hasn't been taking place?
I'll give you my feeling about that. There was many years ago when we were the only. I'm sure most of us at this table remember being the first or the only in many places. And that was comfortable because corporations want to believe, I honestly believe, that they should represent the market that they serve. So when there's just one person or two people or less than 10 people, as that number increases, it changes the workplace completely. And I believe if you start to talk to some of those early folks in those companies, one of the things that's been missing and one of the things that I add in my training is the word psychological safety. Because it's more than diversity. You know, just hiring 10 people does not affect the bottom line. Because those 10 people, if they're not safe, will still not infuse their culture or their community's culture into the organization.
Now, we hear so much about diversity training and diversity as just the word used alone, but when you use the words diversity and inclusion, can you just give us a little bit of history of that and what it means together?
Sure. When I started my work 20 plus years ago, it was diversity training. And that meant we needed a diverse workplace. We then moved toward inclusion, which meant, okay, we're here now. We need to include those voices. We need to be sure that they are safe enough to speak up and look at an ad, for example, and say, that doesn't represent my community. We've moved further than that now to equity training. I skipped over equality because that was in there as well. But equity training means that every voice is valued. Not only are we at the table, not only are our voices heard, but they're valued. And that we're treated with equity across the board, with opportunities for promotion and opportunities to lead, and some hope that we can actually raise through the executive ranks of the organization or the city.
Well, speaking of the business community has and always has had tremendous power and influence in these kinds of conversations. What do you see coming out of the business community in response to some of these waves that are not just in Florida, they're sweeping the nation?
What we need are dedicated business leaders who are willing to be the person who puts their foot out front and is willing. I'll use a TV station as an example. I'll use Hallmark Station. Last Christmas, I used to call, forgive me, but I used to call Hallmark, white Christmas movies. Last Christmas, for some reason, I picked up Hallmark one night, and I was like amazed because I saw people of color, I saw gay people, I saw members of the LGBTQ.
And we know why.
And we know why.
Oh.
We attended a Black Film Festival, and that was featured.
CEO, I think.
Right, brought in the right people.
I love it.
And now it's a different world.
There's your answer.
Yeah.
I saw biracial couples. It was heartwarming.
Yes.
For the first Christmas ever to be able to watch an evening of Hallmark movies. So that's what it takes.
That reminds me of the princess, that we now have a Black princess, the animated.
Yes.
And how much of an impact it had on Black children. So,
absolutely.
Yes, little girls.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Seeing themselves.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. When we were children, we couldn't have a doll.
No.
So do you think that this lack of interest in this diversity agenda that's taking place right now is harmful?
Absolutely. And I think that we have to speak up, we as a community, to stop it. It can't continue. If you think back, our parents lived through Jim Crow. We lived through the Civil Rights Movement, where we made some huge sweeping changes in the 60s. But unfortunately, we're reversing now. So it's going to take a next generation of people to literally speak up and say, I won't watch that station. I won't buy that product.
Sounds like you're going to have to send that letter out again that you sent to some of your clients.
The letter that said, if you think your Black employees are okay, they're not.
Mm-hmm. But it also has to do with power, right? To pursue an agenda, you have to have the power. And the power comes from the vote, for example.
Yes.
That's one of the means.
Yes.
Economic power is another. This whole thing recently where we had the Kanye incident showed that if you have enough power, you can stop discriminatory comments.
That's true.
Right? You can make that happen. You can say, no, I'm not going to accept this. This is intolerable. And you will be heard.
Yes.
So what happens with us is, in the Black community, we have numbers. Yes, we do. But what can we do to access that kind of power?
Exercise that power in a more compactful, meaningful way.
You hit it first with vote. You know, it's discouraging for me to hear the number of African Americans who tell me they're not voting because they don't think their vote counts. And then we look at this: 70% of the players in the NBA and the NFL, they have money. You know, money is power.
Yeah, I said that.
You know, so it's harnessing our vote, harnessing the financial abilities that our community does have, and speaking up and making statements.
And voting, I will just say, does make a difference.
Absolutely.
I can tell you, we represent municipalities, and I've seen many, many elections. And as a former supervisor of elections attorney for over 20 years, I can tell you, I've seen many elections where people have lost by a vote.
Absolutely.
A vote.
Absolutely.
So voting matters.
And local elections matter. You know, we come out to vote for president. Our school board, for example, in Palm Beach County last year had developed an equity statement for the students. And it was a wonderful statement. It was so broad and sweeping. It would make every child feel comfortable. And the majority parents did not want that to go. And we took it to a school board vote, and they were forced to change the statement because the school board voted against it.
So it was a statement to make it more inclusive.
Absolutely.
For everyone.
I remember that. And actually, you know, I'm glad we're on this subject because sometimes we can get lost in thinking that things look so gloom and doom and there's really no out, because it does feel like this time is just very different from anything that I've seen in my lifetime in terms of the climate and what's happening and what people feel free to say. Gee, I was in the grocery line the other day at a supermarket, and someone just yelled out, Biden inflation. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. Who does that?
In corporate America today, for example, an employee who feels that they're not being treated properly, do they have the same access to voice their concerns? Is it diminished because of this new environment?
I believe it is, and I believe it certainly matters who's in the HR suite and who's taking that complaint, whether they're in a union or not, makes a difference. And there's that phrase that I heard one of you use earlier before the show today that people are still using, and that's reverse discrimination. You know, so, you know, people are there. I fear that people are just sitting there saying, I'll just take it because it's not worth it. But it is worth it. And everybody has to have that voice and speak up. I also warn HR directors, I probably shouldn't say this publicly, but I warn HR directors that after I've come through to train on microaggressions and things that people should look out for, they will have a spike in complaints because people will suddenly feel empowered and be able to say something. And that makes me feel wonderful.
Can you train on that now? Microaggressions?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I can. I can do microaggressions because I make it very broad. You know, I've been very careful through the years that my training is race, it's ethnicity, it's sexual orientation, it's ability. So when I make it all inclusive that way, it's easier for people to digest.
And do you use the word microaggression?
I do, but I have a disclaimer slide at the beginning of my presentation, remember, and it says you don't have to be in this room.
Now, it's interesting because I sit on this board for Broward County, which is the Racial Equity Board, and it was established. The thought behind it was that, you know, we have a time, and I think this came about through former Commissioner Holness, who thought that we're in a time when, you know, we need to have this type of training, and we had leaders come in, and I'm not sure
The
what
Racial Equity Institute.
Yes, and they were excellent, and they talked about the historical significance and why we all need to be on the same page. And I'll tell you, at the end of the 2-day training, there were white men crying on the Zoom, and I thought, wow, it was so powerful.
That's the training that the state reached out to some agencies that get funding and told them to cease and desist paying for that training.
Yes. And in fact, it used to be mandatory that people who sat on this board had to have this training, but now I think even Broward County is doing some type of disclaimer that you don't have to, it's not mandatory.
They are. I worked for them for a while. It's an intense, everybody should take that 2-day training.
Yes, it's excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to be the devil's advocate, just to say that there are a lot of people who may be well-intended, who believe that if they don't talk about it, they'll disappear, and we won't have these issues if we just don't raise them. We just don't talk about our differences, etc. Nobody's going to be harmed, and everybody's going to get along. Your thoughts on that?
It's insanity. It's absolute insanity. And I do believe that people believe that. I personally am not racist, somebody may say. I'm not treating people differently. I give everybody equal opportunity. So if we just didn't talk about this, we'd just be fine. But that's where I have to go back to our ancestors. So if our ancestors didn't talk about it, we wouldn't be voting today. We wouldn't be working in the careers that we work in today. So, I feel bound to have these discussions, and I hope that people, no matter what their race or ethnicity or background, but I tell folks when they talk about people feeling uncomfortable, you didn't do it. Wasn't you. But it happened in this country and in our land and in your city.
And there's so much evidence of it and how it affected Black people in particular.
What do you see in our young people? I'm always optimistic about the future because I think young people have an understanding, they have broader access to more diverse media. What do you see for the future?
People, it depends on who I'm talking to. I have people tell me that our faith is in the next generation. Well, I have been called to do work in schools where kids can't get along in schools. I had a young Black girl who went home crying recently, and she was 8 for the name she was called in the classroom. So we have to remember that our young people are being taught at home.
But it was uplifting after George Floyd to see that that everybody was up in arms. Like it looked as if everyone was.
Everybody.
It was but they were young. They were diverse.
Yep. We have to harness those.
Yes.
And not discourage them. For those of you out there who have kids that are that enlightened, we have to remember, and I don't want to upset the balance of your show, but we have to remember that out of Tallahassee, the words were said, Florida's where woke comes to die. Quote. So, we don't want to kill woke. We want that to live in our children, but we have to encourage them.
And we can't be afraid to say it either.
I've always thought that this saying that woke means something negative, it's really so strange. Because woke means I am aware, for example, that someone is different, and I will go out of my way to make sure I'm not harming that person, for example, by calling them a name they don't want to be called. Do you understand what I'm saying? If that's woke, why isn't that a positive?
But that's happening with so many terms where they're being turned around to sound like there's something really horrible, and people are buying into it, and they're not pushing back against it, and that's a problem. But I want to, before we conclude, I want to just go to where we are with corporations and funding, because I remember right after the George Floyd incident where corporate entities were saying they have all of this money that's going to be available for, training and organizations and people who were doing great things like the Women of Color Empowerment Institute. I'm thinking, gee, it's in our name. We have a 10-year history of of doing all kinds of great work, and it works. And we engage the community, not only in this area, but in other areas where we have chapters. And I'm thinking, surely we'll get funding. Well, my goodness, other than the people that were already funding us, we have not received one new commitment, and I'm just surprised. So, what happened with all of this money that people were talking about?
You missed the window.
Did I? I mean, was it open for 2 seconds?
It was open for the summer.
Yes,
and that was it. And now it's gone. It's passed. We're not talking about Derek Chauvin went to prison.
Yeah.
So that fixed it. It's done. It's over.
We
have to start all over again. And sadly, I hope starting all over again does not mean another disaster or a catastrophe happening. Mm-hmm. Because this country responds to war, it responds to angry, it responds to killing, it responds to things that we just don't respond well to conversations.
Well, those catastrophes, they are things that happen pretty much currently and often. They just aren't filmed all the time. And what happens is that in this particular case, we saw it live. That was different.
Do you know also one of the things that passed in last year's legislature was that you cannot interfere with police activity, which means that if they see you filming, they can say you were interfering with their investigation.
I wonder what that was intended to address.
It was direct correlation to George Floyd. Because if that young person had not been filming, that never would have happened.
Well, let's hope the pictures can be captured from a distance.
Yes.
That way you're not interfering.
For body cams. And,
yes.
And municipalities that are really forcing their police departments to go in the direction of being more responsible and transparent.
And having them trained to keep them on.
Yes.
Yes.
More importantly.
Yeah. I don't want to leave it a complete. I think there's hope. This conversation is hope. The fact that you have sponsors at all is hope. The fact that you have hundreds of women at a conference every year is hope. So I think there's hope, but we have to remain vigilant. We can't pause for a minute. And some of us are tired. I'm old. I need that next generation to come along and take over the mantle. I'm ready to pass it on.
Let's hope they do.
Retirement beckons.
Yeah, let's hope they do pick it up.
I hope so.
Well, that's our time today. Thanks so much for joining us, Barbara. You're certainly a friend of the Institute. And until the next time,
be empowered.